Wonderful. All right. So today we're starting off our second day by talking about this net zero benefit climate change policy, and I'm very excited by the experts that we have speaking here today. So first, we're going to have Bethany Davis-Noel, who is Executive Director of the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center at NYU. Then we're going to have Jonathan Adler, who's the Johan Verheij Memorial Professor of Law at Case Western. And then we'll have Ralph Fuchs, who's the Managing Director at the Centrum Liberal Moderna. And what the theme for this panel is climate regulation in this transatlantic context in both the United States and in Europe. We're going to really be focusing on sort of three big questions. One is the different approaches to regulation that have been taken on both sides of the Atlantic and how those have been driven by, sort of realpolitik questions. So you could think about questions such as the extent to which you regulate climate change. Some have thought, well, there's not much incentive to regulate climate change unless it is sort of joined up internationally. But on the other hand, there are arguments for unilateral action on climate change something that many of us have written about, and so it'll be interesting to look at that sort of basic question, but also on the different approaches to regulation, whether it is carbon pricing, cap and trade systems, some of the newer methods like the major investments and subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as some of the talk of border carbon adjustments on both sides of the Atlantic. The second question that we'll talk about that's of increasing importance in both Europe and the United States is the dialogue between courts and policymakers, whether it's the legislature or the executive, because we've seen important climate policies overturned by the courts in both Europe and in the U.S. And so I'd love for you all to talk a little bit about that. And then the final sort of theme for these remarks will be some of the tensions and dialogues between local, be it state, provincial, et cetera, regulators, national regulators, and international regulators. Because at times we've seen take a more cooperative approach. At times there's been tensions. Obviously, in the U.S., we often talk about that in the context of federalism. And so, really looking forward to the remarks. As I said, we'll start with Bethany. I've been throughout trying to convince Bethany and Jonathan to make sure they have plenty to argue about, and I've seen them arguing, and I've seen them arguing both last night and this morning, which is making me very happy.
Discussing.
Well, I want a spirited discussion. That's what I'm looking for. So, Bethany, please.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, he's built up the hype for fireworks. Please don't stress about that. We're gonna have a great discussion. Really glad to be here. Thanks, James. And so I'll tell you what I'm gonna do to get us started. So the question that we were given for this panel, I love this question. It really sets us up really well. It's got this idea in here that unilateral climate-related policies are irrational, basically. Why would we do them? And then it asks, why is it happening? And why would we do them? Because they drive up energy costs and they're harmful and so on. Okay, so we've been asked to answer the question of why, and I was told I could just answer it. So that's why I love this question. Okay. So what's happening, and then we also agreed that I would go first, and that means that I have to tell you all what is happening too. So I'm going to start with that, and then start the conversation about why. Okay, so what's happening? So there's three big buckets. I'm sure you've all read about all of this, but I'll just cover it for us so we have a grounding. Litigation, legislation, and regulations. Three big buckets of things that are happening in this country. Which were, you could describe them as unilateral, but I'll get to us in a second why that's not true. Okay, so on litigation, I've got these in totally random order. There's actually a ton of things happening on the litigation front, and I'm sure I've forgotten things, so my co-panelists will fill that in. But let's start with the constitutional cases. There's those kinds of cases are happening at the federal level and at the state level. At the federal level, they're happening without a specific constitutional provision at play. That's the Juliana case. At the state level, we do have constitutional provisions that are specifically on point that the plaintiffs are using. And I just thought I'd throw these two on the screen. Held v. State of Montana is a case that the plaintiffs recently won in Montana, and that case is on appeal now. Montana appealed that case. And then this other interesting case in Hawaii against the Hawaii Department of Transportation just recently settled. And I think that's actually the first of its kind. It's quite interesting to read the settlement agreement. And it has the youth plaintiffs brought this case based on based on Hawaii's constitution. And it has the Department of Transportation agreeing to specific measures and to work with the kid plaintiffs on those measures. So that's the other case I have on here. Then there's a whole bunch of other cases being brought by cities and states. Let's start with consumer deception. Connecticut's got this case against Exxon that is about how Exxon lied and is in violation of the consumer deception statute that's at state level. And those statutes, if you're not aware, they're extremely powerful. They were passed at the state level at a time when people in general thought companies and corporations had too much power and that the FTC had abdicated its responsibility. So these statutes, these little FTC acts all over the country, give states very broad powers. Connecticut's doesn't have a statute of limitations. There are often things that the state doesn't have to prove, that are just left out of it. And so these cases are quite significant cases. I've got the city and county of Honolulu on here too. That case right now is the subject of a cert petition, and the Supreme Court just asked the Solicitor General for their opinions. Okay, then we've got torts, public nuisance. This is a case that was brought by a tribe in Washington. There's public nuisance, and there's product liability in that case. These are all about climate change hurting the people in these states and how the company should do something about that. Then there's investor protection. These are about how companies are lying to their investors about the impacts of climate change. And that's, by the way, that I'm pretty sure I missed some things, but it's a raft of cases across the country. Okay, that's that bucket. Legislation, of course, we all know about the Inflation Reduction Act. We did hear about that yesterday as self-help. I thought that was a great description. This is the signing of that statute. In the Inflation Reduction Act, we do have one stick that has to do with methane, but it's mostly carrots. And that means and the carrots are in the form of tax credits. And the interesting thing about that statute is that there's no upper limit on the number of tax credits that companies can apply for. So I can't tell you like the number, like the amount of money that this statute says is going to be used for this problem, because it's really limitless. It's anything that you want to do in the clean energy space at any level of like the supply chain, you can get massive credits that kind of stack on top of each other. So it's just an infusion of money into the problem. Okay, then regulations. So I know we're definitely gonna have a conversation about this. I don't know about fireworks. On regulations, just recently, because it's sort of the end of the first term of the Biden administration. It seems like that's what's happening right now. It's summer 2024. And so we've seen a bunch of regulations come out. On the first screen I had, light and medium duty vehicles. And then here I've got greenhouse gas emission standards for power plants, standards for the oil and gas sector, which is about methane, and then heavy duty vehicles as well. And just to refresh everybody's recollection about what these regulations are about, in this country, transportation is our biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And then after that is electric power, and then industry. The industry column is about industry using energy to do things and emitting. And so these regulations really get at our biggest sources. That's what's happening. So we'll debate how much they're going to accomplish, but they're a big deal. They've got huge numbers involved with them. And that's what's going on the regulatory front. Okay, now the question of why, which is the part I was really excited to get to. So I'll just offer some thoughts that we can talk through. One, why, very clearly, is states and cities see the harms on the other side. The rising sea level, the flooding that they've already had to clean up, the heat waves where people have died, the extreme rainstorms that New York City has had twice in the last year, where there's flooding. Those cost money. And you can look, this website's actually really interesting. You can look at numbers already. 2023 alone, this study that the NOAA National Centers for Environmental Information Research, that this center shows, shows that in 2023 alone, the climate events cost the United States $92 billion. So yeah, so how much is it going to cost if we don't do anything? That's the one way to answer the question of why. And then the other one is there's this idea that if the United States plays a leadership role on the international scene, that will actually affect other countries and cause them to cut emissions, and that will help us. So it's self-help again. And I just wanted to raise up this document for you all because I think it's really interesting. This is what the Biden administration put out on how to calculate the harms of climate change emissions. It's the social cost of carbon. I don't know how many of you are as obsessed with that as I am. But it's a very interesting metric that you can use to calculate how much it's going to cost if you emit an additional ton of carbon emissions, and based on extensive modeling. And then you can weigh it. You can look at how much it's going to cost to emit, and you can look at how much it's going to cost to not emit, and then you can decide with economic principles which thing you want to do. And so this document provides all the analysis and research behind that calculation. And the thing I wanted to flag was this whole section they have about reciprocity. So obviously we talked already to this weekend about how the United States economy is inextricably linked to the rest of the world. This is from the section of the document that I wanted you to know about. We've got this really big impact from climate change that we face in spillovers. So that's just at play. And then this research shows there's like several pages with studies stacked and stacked and stacked, just analysis that goes back over time that shows that international greenhouse gas emission activities taken in response to U.S. policies that reduce emissions will also benefit us here. And the studies in this paper have examined the evidence of mitigation reciprocity through both policy diffusion and technology diffusion. And that's one way to answer the question of why. We do want other people to do it too, and if we do it, it'll happen. And there's studies and evidence of that happening. And that's my beginning of the answer to the question of why. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. All right, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to be back at my old stomping grounds. So I live in Cleveland now, and I used to live right on Lake Erie. And when I lived there, back in 2007, 2006, there was this idea that we should have wind turbines on Lake Erie. And the idea was that we have offshore wind in the ocean in various parts of the world, that we should have it in the Great Lakes as well. And from an engineering standpoint, it's actually a different challenge to do wind turbines in freshwater than in saltwater. But Lake Erie seemed to be like a good spot. So in 2007, an organization was launched that was going to do a relatively modest pilot program for freshwater offshore wind. That was 2007. This past December, 16 years later, after extensive work seeking permit after permit, dealing with lawsuit after lawsuit, and even after the promise of something like $50 million from the Department of Energy, LEEDCO, the nonprofit entity that had been created to do this project, said we give up. And I think this is a good way of encapsulating a lot of what we do in climate policy. We're really good at announcing broad aspirations for things we want to do at some point in the future. We're really good at symbolic actions. We're really bad at the implementation and the follow-through of that. And we are averse to doing anything, and generally unwilling to do anything, that imposes costs on ourselves in the present for the hope of benefits in the future. And we don't have a set of institutional structures right now that help us navigate that. So I have a much more cynical view both of what we're doing and why we're doing it. But unfortunately, I think it shows in the policies that we have. So start kind of with on the regulatory side of things. Congress has not, with the exception of the methane provision and the Inflation Reduction Act and some stuff related to greenhouse forcing ozone depleting substances that we've committed to phasing out, done nothing legislatively that would regulate greenhouse gases. Instead, we've spent the last 17 years or so trying to figure out how to apply the Clean Air Act to greenhouse gas emissions. The Supreme Court, in a case called Massachusetts versus EPA, said that the language of the Clean Air Act was sufficiently broad and capacious that it could accommodate greenhouse gas emissions and allow for the regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. And then since then, in various cases, we've dealt with the fact that when you get beyond easy things, like greenhouse gas emissions from automobiles, you can't do it, particularly when it comes to emissions from stationary sources, because if you apply the numerical thresholds that are written into the Act to greenhouse gases, you come up with a program that the EPA in the states just can't implement because they have to regulate too much. And the short reason for that is that these numerical thresholds were written based on understandings of the volume of emissions of traditional pollutants that are emitted by stationary sources. And that gives you a relatively confined universe of facilities you're going to regulate. But when you apply those same numerical thresholds to carbon dioxide, you increase the universe of regulated facilities more than 100-fold. And we just don't have the people, the time, et cetera, to do that. And the EPA, for a period of time, tried to argue it had the authority to rewrite the numerical thresholds by regulatory fiat, and might have been able to do that through enforcement discretion. The problem, though, is that the Clean Air Act includes citizen supervisions, which means that a facility that needs a permit under the statute that doesn't have one is subject to litigation risk, whether or not the EPA is taking action against them or not. And so the Supreme Court ultimately said, yeah, we're not going to apply these provisions to stationary sources. We've also had efforts to rewrite other provisions of the law, the Clean Power Plan being the most notorious example of this, which the Supreme Court rejected in a case called West Virginia versus EPA. But even if it weren't for these litigation challenges, the very idea that we're going to use the Clean Air Act to deal with the greenhouse gas emission problem just seems to be not serious. Because once you get past power plants and automobiles, you still have the other half of emissions you got to deal with. And the pieces that you can break off and regulate become increasingly small if you're going to get to net zero. And each one of them requires its own rulemaking, if not multiple rulemakings. And we don't have an administrative process that's capable of handling that throughput. In the Obama administration, reasonably aggressive environmental regulator, the EPA, on average, issued 7 to 8 major rules per year across all of the Environmental Protection Agency's programs. If you look at what people project would be necessary for the EPA to regulate all the relevant sectors, cement and buildings and et cetera, you would have to double that just for the climate program. EPA doesn't have the ability to do that. Set aside litigation risk, set aside the political consequences of that. Just in terms of throughput capacity, the agency can't do that if that's our approach. But yet we talk about that being the way we're going to deal with it. The Emission Reduction Act.
Jonathan,
Yep.
could you speak into the mic?
Oh, sure, sorry. The Inflation Reduction Act is an alternative way of approaching this, right? So instead of regulating our way to lower emissions, we're going to subsidize it and subsidize cleaner energy, but we have that same throughput problem. All of the estimates about the emission reductions that the Inflation Reduction Act can generate are premised upon the deployment of technologies, and in particular, the deployment of transmission that have no connection to what we're actually doing. It takes right now, on average, 4 years to permit a wind or solar program or wind or solar facility, one that's actually going to happen, not like the ones in Lake Erie that never did, not like, I think, the ones like Cape Wind or the several hundred wind projects that have been restricted or blocked in the tables that Robert Bryce has put together. Transmission, on average, takes 10 years to permit. The Princeton studies that have given us fairly optimistic assumptions about what the Inflation Reduction Act can generate are all based on the assumption that we're going to increase the rate at which we're deploying transmission capacity by something like 50%. But in fact, the rate at which we're deploying transmission is actually declining. It's going in the opposite direction. And it's the same problem in some respects. We don't have the throughput capacity to handle the permitting, to handle the analysis that our current laws require of things like transmission. On top of that, when you're dealing with transmission for things like wind and solar, and our moderator could speak at this at much greater length than I can, we need infrastructure that spans large distances. To get the power from where it's generated to where it's going to be used. And that means you magnify the problem because you have jurisdictional hurdles. You're not merely dealing with permitting at the federal level, you're dealing with it at the state level, you're dealing with it at the local level, you're dealing with various rules that actually create an interface between federal and state regulatory processes that allow additional opportunities for opponents, those who feel they are bearing disproportionate costs, to disrupt that deployment. The one place we've seen successful rapid deployment of transmission capacity is Texas, because it was all within one state, and a state that is blessed to have very little federal land. And so a lot of the problems that other transmission deployment face, it didn't face. And we haven't thought seriously about how we're going to deal with that. In fact, the Biden administration has been undoing or has undone some of the efforts the Trump administration made to at least deal with the federal environmental impact statement aspect of this problem. Supreme Court just granted cert on a portion of that, and so maybe we'll get some relief there. The litigation that we've seen, I think, fits into this kind of emphasis on symbolism, emphasis on imposing costs on others and capturing benefits for ourselves. So what are the tort suits and the consumer protection suits? What ultimately are they about? They're about jurisdictions trying to get money for themselves, at best, to fund adaptation efforts, right? So existing infrastructure was built based on certain assumptions about climatic changes and climatic stresses, and climate change is disrupting some of those assumptions. It's costly to make those changes. The most optimistic take one can make of those suits is this is an effort by local jurisdictions to get some of that money back. And funding adaptation is a good thing. But it doesn't do much of anything to reduce emissions. It doesn't do much of anything to mitigate the risks of climate change. It, at best, results in a transfer of funds from emitters and consumers to jurisdictions that bear these adaptation expenses. There is a more optimistic story, right, that maybe this litigation, if it's allowed to continue, and thus far the Supreme Court and federal courts have allowed it to continue, I think correctly as a legal matter, whether as a policy matter, separate issue, but certainly correctly as a legal matter, that maybe this forces some grand political compromise. And so maybe that's a way we get beyond this practice of doing lots of symbolic stuff that doesn't produce much tangible result. I have probably 30 seconds left. So if we want to think about the international aspect of this, again, we do lots of symbolic stuff. Paris, right? Paris is ultimately meaningless for climate policy. It's not binding in any meaningful sense. And we don't have historical precedent that shows that countries getting together is going to result in them all agreeing to do things at substantial costs to themselves for global environmental benefit when the costs are large. We only see that happen when the costs are low. Think about the Montreal Protocol. Why did the United States agree to the Montreal Protocol when it did? Well, it didn't agree until the costs of phasing out CFCs were low. There were substantial interests in the United States that were going to benefit from that, right? The patents on CFCs had expired. American companies had the patents on their replacements. And the costs of getting global compliance were a check the United States could afford to write and was willing to write. So the payment to countries like India to forego cheap refrigeration were viable. In climate change, and Cass Sunstein has an old paper that I think goes through these numbers pretty well, we're nowhere near that, right? We don't have the equivalent of a relatively inexpensive way of reaching net zero. We don't have the ability to implement it in a relatively cheap and quick way, and we certainly don't have the willingness or the ability to write a check to other parts of the world, particularly where there's 1 billion plus people that don't have access to reliable energy, let alone clean, reliable energy. So we're not in a situation where the sort of international agreement that would matter is even on the table. So if we want to change that, and I'm over time, so I'm just going to say this in one sentence, and I'm happy to elaborate in Q&A, we have to be thinking more seriously about how do we drive down the costs of net zero in a way that it's something through our normal political processes we can negotiate over. And everything else we're doing in the meantime is symbolic. It's a way of shifting around costs, but it's not a way of actually getting to where at least some of us think we would like to go.
Thanks so much. Ralph, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me. I'm not a law person. I belong history and green politics, but also in writing on thinking on environmental issues, climate policy, greening the economy, and more on the, I would say, the relationship and the tensions between climate policy, climate protection, and liberal democracy. But this is maybe a different area. So I will focus on a kind of critical account of the European and specifically the German climate policy over the last 20 years. Of course, not with the intention that we should scrap it, but I'm quite convinced that we need a new attempt, and you will find some overlappings with what Jonathan already has been laid out. So European climate policy is at a critical point, not only because of the shift of the political spectrum to the right towards parties that see an ambitious climate policy as a threat to growth and prosperity, rather than an opportunity. Climate protection has also moved further back in voters' priorities. The public focus is now on concerns about economic and social decline, inflation, uncontrolled migration, the large-scale war on our doorsteps, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and the need for security in times of turbulent change, security in a very broad sense. In addition, there are other critical developments that are slowing down a bold climate policy, and I will focus on that. First, while CO2 emissions have been falling in the OECD world since 1990, by around 30% in the European Union and even 40% in Germany, they continue to rise in the global south. Emissions from these countries, especially China, India, and some others, now account for almost 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. It is therefore clear that the industrial nations of the West cannot stop global warming on their own. At the same time, a global climate policy is being prevented by intensified geopolitical conflicts, especially with Russia and China. It is true that a national or even European-centered strategy increases the costs of climate transformation, but we have neither international treaties with binding reduction targets nor supranational institutions that could enforce compliance and ensure fair burden sharing. International climate policy is largely dependent on voluntary cooperation and therefore on win-win models. Third, in view of the economic concerns, the costs of climate transformation and the impact on private households and the global competitiveness of domestic industries are coming more to the fore. This is particularly true for Germany. The costs of the German energy transition to date already amount to around 500 billion euros, and they continue to rise. Yet, also more than half of electricity now comes from renewable sources, which is a success story. Oil, gas, and coal still account for around 80% of total energy consumptions after 20 years of energy transition. Energy costs are now a critical economic and social political factor. So I agree with Jonathan that we have to find policies and strategies which bring down the costs of a climate transition. Fourth, the costs of decarbonization are further increased by a lack of regulatory clarity. In Europe, I guess it's not so much different from the US. We are dealing with a jumble of incoherent regulations and instruments, from the European emissions trading systems, ETS, to a multitude of detailed regulations with tens of thousands of paragraphs. It remains unclear why, in addition to a cross-sector ETS, there needs to be a plethora of detailed climate-related regulations, from building heating to car drive technologies. Politicians and administrators are getting bogged down in the micromanagement of the climate transformation instead of concentrating on the regulatory framework and the critical infrastructure needed to stipulate competition for the best solutions. Or, in other words, to set free a market dynamics for the green transition. The tighter the regulations, the longer planning and approval procedures take, and the higher the costs. This paralyzes the dynamics of innovation and the willingness to invest, on which the success of the climate transformation depends. Fifth, a closer comparison between the US and Europe shows that there is no less funding available for climate-friendly innovations and investments in the EU. In the combination of the European Green Deal, which contains around about 500 billion euro, and other European and national funding programs, money seems not the impasse. The crucial difference lies in the design of the funding. In the US, so I'm told by business people, it seems less bureaucratic, more flexible, and better tailored to the needs of companies, while the European Union creates enormous hurdle for the use of its funding. Sixth, what do the European elections mean for European climate policy? With the exception of France and to a certain extent Germany, the European elections did not result in the feared dam breaking to the right. The democratic center, conservatives and Christian Democrats, moderate socialists, liberals, European Greens, very different from their US replicants, still holds. With regard to the European Union's climate and energy policy, this probably means continuity rather than a fundamental change of course. However, it was already apparent during the election campaign that climate policy is no longer a top priority of European politics. The climate policy ambitions of the new Commission will be muted, while issues of European economic competitiveness and security of supply will dominate. Within this paradigm, there are considerable differences as to what kind of policy is needed to secure Europe's industrial future. With extended deficit spending, demand-side policies and subsidies, or with an improvement in the framework conditions for private investment, especially modern infrastructure, digitalization, education and science, lower taxes and duties, and less bureaucracy. The European Green Deal will not be scrapped, but it stands now under the primacy of European economic competitiveness. Protectionist tendencies under the banner of European strategic autonomy will tend to become stronger. One particularly critical case will be the introduction of carbon tariffs for industrial imports. These CO2-related charges are intended to compensate for diverging environmental standards and cost levels between European business and other large industrialized regions, especially China. This mechanism is also controversial within the EU, as it carries the risk of a spiral of protectionist counteractions that would hurt especially German exports. There will also be growing pressure to cut back the overshoot of bureaucratic regulations, and this is not necessarily a bad thing if it curbs the temptation for micromanagement and detailed control by the Commission and national governments. The critical question will be whether the ETS, the European Emission Trading Scheme, is retained as the core instrument of European climate policy and expanded into a cross-sectoral mechanism, including not only the energy sector and industry, but also buildings, heating and cooling, mobility, and agriculture. The negative scenario is that economic competitiveness and jobs will be played out or will be played off against an ambitious climate policy. And this makes it even more important to demonstrate that climate-friendly technologies and products are a building block for the future of European industries. So my conclusion is that we have to think much more about synergies between climate protection, ecologic goals, and economic dynamics. Yeah, so to set free a process of green innovation and green investments, which is market-driven. But for that, of course, state policies have to set a regulatory framework, especially concerning pricing. Pricing not only of CO2 emissions, but also other environmental and the public goods. And then concentrate on the infrastructure, which is needed, the transition grid, the infrastructure for a hydrogen economy, CO2 pipelines for CCS, and this kind of stuff. So finally, we cannot escape the magic triangle between environmental goals and needs, economic growth, and social welfare. Yeah, we have to then combine these three elements. Otherwise, our then climate policy will fail. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ralph. All right. Well, trying to provoke some disagreement, I have to say, let me just say a couple things that I agree with each of you on, and that's sort of leading to a question. So first, Bethany identified two main reasons that you might want unilateral regulation, realpolitik reasons. The first, of course, is the cost of climate change, and both Jonathan and Ralph appropriately emphasize that no one country's efforts are going to solve climate change, but I do think it's important to understand that for major emitters like the US and the EU, their actions can actually have a pretty significant impact. So if you look under the, even standing alone, even if they don't lead to any matching sort of actions in other places. So if you look at the social cost of carbon calculated by the Obama administration, I think it was about $42 a ton, but they said basically the benefit in the US would still be, in the US alone would be about $7 to $12 a ton. So effectively, and that's basically just because the US is a quarter to a fifth of the world's economy, and so basically it gets about a quarter to the fifth of the benefit of any regulation it adopts. So it's not a zero benefit, there is some benefit even within the US. And the second thing that Bethany identified, of course, is that leadership question, right? That maybe if we, and I think that's undoubtedly true to some extent, that both as an example to other countries, that makes it easier for us to push for them to regulate, and also we develop technologies, as Ralph suggested, this idea of developing, so models of green energy that show themselves to be secure and reliable so that those technologies are used in other countries. I would note, however, that to the extent that it also, when we act on climate change, it creates opportunities for other countries to, specialize in other things that we're not producing. So there's different effects on both sides, and I think one focus of my research has been how do we try and get more out of those positive feedback loops and less of the negative feedback loops in climate policy. How do you design mechanisms to do that? The second thing I wanted to say is that I very much agree. Jonathan's point is incredibly important that, look, clean energy just takes much more infrastructure that's harder to get permission to build. If you take your dirtier energy sources like coal and oil, those are very easy to transport and store. Now take your cleaner energy sources, whether it's even natural gas, but electricity or carbon pipelines. All of those depend on linear infrastructure from wherever that solar farm is to whoever needs that electricity. And those transmission lines are one of the hardest single things to get permission to build in many jurisdictions, including on both sides of the Atlantic. So that is an incredible challenge. And I will note that the degree of difficulty of that challenge is just increasing because of the rise in interest rates. So if you're looking at spending a lot of money today to get permission to build a project in 10 years or in 15 years, that is a huge challenge, particularly because of another thing that Ralph mentioned, which is that you don't have a lot of confidence in the stability of climate policy. Particularly there may be some trade-off between ambition of policy and stability of policy. And so the question is, how do we produce a stable policy that encourages those investments that are needed for that clean energy transition. So just after those observations, I just wanted to offer you each a chance to respond to anything that was said from the other panelists. And then I'll have a couple more questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
I have some thoughts.
Great.
Okay, so this is a lot of fun. One thing, one thing I heard from Jonathan, I heard on the panel, is this idea that we can't do it with our existing Clean Air Act regulations, or with the existing Clean Air Act, I should say, and the lawsuits aren't going to do enough, and so on. And the cost point, which we need to get to a place where the costs spur this. And that we haven't done anything, international with reciprocity unless the costs were actually low enough. And I think the cost point is a wonderful insight. I think it's an excellent insight. I just do want to say, though, that just because this is hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. You wouldn't, if I was punching myself in the face for a month, it wouldn't be like I should keep going, like I should still stop. It's never too late to stop punching yourself in the face. Okay, so that's one thing. And on the cost too, that is the point of the IRA and a lot of other legislation. It was politically highly difficult to get any more out of Congress. And it's politically very difficult to get transmission. It's not just about the permitting regime and the rules and all that. It's politically difficult. There are campaigns that are being funded to stop new transmission projects all over. And that's an existential narratives battle that we don't really need to engage in if we actually want to solve this problem. So that's why that's on my mind as we talk through all the challenges. We need to talk about the challenges in a way where we're fixing them together. Because you're right, it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem, and so it does mean we have to work together, and it doesn't mean we should just stop and not work on it. The other thing I wanted to say is, okay, so the question about whether the lawsuits are gonna get us anything. I actually think the Hawaii case is really interesting. It does get something out of the Department of Transportation in Hawaii, which is amazing. The rest of the lawsuits, it is going to be a big long battle. And by the way, those are I don't work on any of those cases. Just so you know, I have my academic hat on right now. And so one thing I just thought I'd throw out there about the lawsuits is, sure, they're not about emission cuts, but they are about warnings, and they are about consumer deception, and they are about the social license. And some of them even have claims in them about how we should have warnings at the gas pump, and we should really be socializing the idea of the harms of using fossil fuels more aggressively with people in this country. And that did work with tobacco, right? Once we got the truth out of the tobacco industry, things changed. Like the hotel is like, this is a no-smoking hotel. And I think there is a potential that with more truth in the mix that could be significant. Like I said, I'm not sure actually what the cases are, of what they're going for, but the social license is an important feature. And then I guess bringing down the cost is definitely the right call, and I guess we're, at city, state, and federal, that to the extent that politics aren't standing in the way, that does seem to be where the work is and where the action is. So just wanted to offer that.
Two observations. One is, I do think when it comes to United States looking at Europe and vice versa, there is a grass is greener phenomenon, in the sense that we can see, we're very aware of things we're not happy about what we're doing in our home country, and we see things elsewhere that we think are better. So there was a comment about the regulatory system in the United States appearing more business friendly than in Europe, but I look at something like offshore wind. The largest freshwater wind installation, it's in the Netherlands, I won't pronounce it properly, opened in 2021. It was proposed in 2019. They started building it in 2020, and they opened it in 2021. And I look at something like that, and I'm like, oh my gosh. A relatively new project with a relatively new technology, because the technology for freshwater is different, because the risks to the turbines from freshwater are different than for saltwater. And that's something like that's would be lightning fast in the United States to think about something being operational in 2 years or 3 years, especially if it's new, especially if it's one of the first of its kind, especially if it's the largest of its kind. So there is this grass is greener phenomenon, and there are some folks, Mario Loyola, I know, has done one paper that try to actually look at in a comparative way about kind of piece by piece, what are the elements that are being done better in different places. And there's a lot of learning that can be done in that way. Are there parts of our regulatory system that are working better for innovation, but different parts that are working better, say on deployment maybe. And that's something we need to spend more time on. On kind of thinking about how to go forward, I'd say my view isn't we don't do anything. My view is we should do smart things, right? Spending a lot of time and money and administrative capacity and governmental time and attention on regulations that are large enough to impose real costs on important constituencies, but aren't enough to meet the targets that we've set for ourselves, let alone to do anything to make it easier for the rest of the world to reduce their emissions, to me seems actually a lot like punching ourselves in the face, right? Because if we're not making progress towards atmospheric stabilization, we're not mitigating the climate risk, but we are imposing substantial costs. And a lot of the things that we're trying to do in the United States, even if we could do them on a time scale that would make sense, really do nothing to help reduce emissions in Nigeria or Brazil, because they're actually not leading to the development and deployment of the technologies that are exportable and transferable, which is part of what we need to be doing and want to be doing. And what I think we need to be doing is looking at what are examples of the sort of transformation that we want in the energy space. And I think we've seen it, right? The most under-heralded environmental success story of the 21st century is dematerialization. The fact that in developed industrialized countries like the United States, we are seeing net dematerialization on a year-over-year basis. We are using fewer molecules of stuff, which if you stop and really think about it and unpack it, is just wild. That next year we will use fewer molecules of stuff than we used this year. We are net dematerializing. Well, why? Well, because when it comes to material, we fully integrated that into our market systems. You pay to get it, you pay to process it, you pay to deploy it, you pay to use it, you pay to throw it away. Carbon, we do only a tiny fraction of that. And so what we've seen, and just giving a good example of dematerialization, what used to be, a ton of copper wire first gets replaced with 150 pounds of sand, right, when we go to fiber optics, and then gets replaced with a few pounds of a variety of precious metals when we go to wireless. Those sorts of transformations are possible, but we have no examples of those sorts of transformations that were planned by agencies, that were regulated or mandated into existence. We see examples of them driven by constant cost pressures on every margin in a competitive market environment. And so we need to think about how do we deploy that sort of institutional structure in the energy space. To me, I think that leads to things like technology inducement prizes, a revenue-neutral carbon tax, in addition to reducing other barriers to innovation. There may be other ways of doing it. So it's not that we shouldn't be doing anything. We should be doing a lot on climate change, in my view. It's just we should be doing very, very different things than what we're doing.
Can I say something?
Yeah, of
That's
course.
great. Look at that. We agree. Okay, but I do want to say something quick. The fact that we wouldn't have an impact on a place like Nigeria, I think, is wrong. I mean, I think we do have the potential to have an impact on what other countries can build. And you can look at what happened here between the European Union and the U.S. They're 10 years ahead of us at least on offshore wind. But they did a bunch of things on offshore wind that proves how to do it. They built these huge turbines, which are incredible to look at. And it took us a long time to get our ducks in a row. But now we're doing it, and we're, the people who built it in Europe are here building it now. And if you look at, I don't know, we should get somebody from Nigeria to actually answer that question. But there are places like South Africa where there's load shifting, where they have to turn off the power because legacy fossil fuel isn't serving the population. They have to build something, and they've got renewable potential there, and you've got to build something, right? It's not a question of just like turn on the gas plants. You've got to build something, and the economic potential with renewables, with offshore wind, with wind, et cetera, that we prove up here could make a difference there. And then the last thing I want to say is the studies that I was telling you guys about in the social cost of carbon paper are all about reciprocity. They have examples and evidence of that actually happening. So, and they're all, economics based, which I know this crew loves. So I really recommend them. Okay.
Ralph, please.
Okay, just some remarks. Maybe I would like to start with China, which is a very interesting example, because China is not only, meanwhile, by far the biggest emittent of greenhouse gas emissions, but it is more and more becoming a champion in green technologies. So we are no longer at the cutting edge in Europe and in the US in a lot of key technologies needed for climate transition. China is intentionally and very strategically trying to get the lead in a lot of these key technologies. It's not only about wind and solar. Europe to 80% is depending from green technology imports from China, meanwhile, in our energy sector. It's also about battery technologies, it's about synthetic fuels, it's about carbon capture and use, not only storage, creating synthetic fuels, electric mobility, clearly. Yeah. So there's also an industrial competition, a race then going on, who will have the lead. And China is doing this not only because of environmental concerns. They clearly have the vision that the industrial future will be green. This is not the matter of debate. The matter is how we get there, how we get there. And here, of course, costs play a crucial role. Up to now, we harvested the low-hanging fruits. If I'm looking to Germany, which I'm more familiar with, yeah, building up renewable energies in the electricity sector up to 50%, this was expensive, but it was the more easy thing. And it was also quite successful in the global impact because Germany, with this renewable energy law on the feed-in tariffs, stipulated the global market for these technologies, economies of scale, and we contributed very much to bring down the cost significantly, more than 90% for wind and solar energy. This is, to a certain extent, a success example we should try to replicate also in other areas, battery technologies and all these kind of things. But now it comes, we are hitting a critical threshold because the higher the degree of the percentage for renewables in our electricity grid, the more you need these kinds of balancing capacities, backup capacities, smart grids, all these kind of things, storage capacity. So it's much more about a systemic transition now. It's not just about single technologies. You have to create a completely new system, energy system. And here, of course, this, on the one hand, this is quite critical for energy-intensive industries. One of the most striking differences between Germany and the US is that our energy costs are 4 times higher than yours. Of course, this is a competitive factor you can't ignore. Yeah? And we already see the flow of investment from Europe and from Germany to the US. It's happening. Also for startups, because of others, this is more the regulatory issue that obviously finally still the US is a much more friendly place for entrepreneurship than Europe. So the critical question is how to finance, I would say, the gap between these pioneer investments which are needed now and which cannot be covered by return on investment and the long-term perspective of a green market economy. Yeah, and so this is why I'm so concerned with the cost issue, because if and it will not just be state subsidies, that's clear. Even for the US, you cannot indefinitely expand public debt and deficit spending to cover this gap.
We're trying.
So
we're trying.
Yeah, I know. You're trying, and of course you are in a privileged position because you still command the world currency, or the most important world currency. And but for us it is clear we have to mobilize private capital, private investment. Otherwise, we will not do it.
So let me So let me say a couple things and then ask a question. So first, I think it's important that people understand that there is cause for optimism in what we've already achieved. If you look year by year, our greenhouse gas emissions, both in the world and the United States, have gone down far from what they were projected to have been at this point. And that, that's in part because of increased deployment of natural gas and renewable in the U.S. that really ate away the coal power share of production. And so Bethany showed a graph where transport emissions were higher than electric emissions. That wasn't always the case because we used to have a lot of emissions in the electricity sector. So I do think it's important to understand all that progress that has been made. And for all the difficulty of deploying new infrastructure, there are places like Texas that have installed a huge amount of solar and wind power. So there are success stories there as well. I do want to focus though on this question that all of you have appropriately focused on, which is infrastructure and secure supply chains, because I think it's absolutely true that one of the implications of something you mentioned, which is that China has led in many of these sort of new clean energy technologies, is of course that we need to develop those supply chains in the US, in Europe, and in friendly countries. But it also sort of raises the question, I think people haven't really thought through the implications of moving to dependence on a metals economy that's frankly dominated by China from the current economy, which is dominated mostly by oil and gas. I mean, the US is the world's #1 oil producer. The U.S. is the world's #1 natural gas producer, and that gives, frankly, both sides of the Atlantic an economic security that, frankly, we lack in the green energy space. So, as an example, when oil prices rose in 2022, we half emptied the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to try and keep them in check because the U.S. has the world's biggest supply of oil. When Europe was cut off of Russian natural gas, the U.S. became the world's #1 liquefied natural gas exporter, sending most of that gas to Europe. And I guess it sort of raises the question, how are we going to have is there a danger that we put ourselves in a precarious position? Because in some ways for China, because they are a major oil importer, they don't have those kind of reserves of oil or natural gas. It makes perfect sense for them to go all in on a green transition, particularly because they dominate processing of minerals like lithium, cobalt, et cetera. It's a much more complicated analysis in the sort of transatlantic community, where of course we want to develop some security and so that we're not dependent on those Chinese supply chains, but also there's a danger of becoming so dependent that we lose the geopolitical security that we have taken for granted. And I wonder if that, at times requires, one thing I notice in all of these countries is that there's often domestic political decisions that are so poisonous to building sort of international supply chains in these, clean energy spaces. So, to take one example, when Germany shuts down nuclear power, they have to import more liquefied natural gas from the U.S., and that meant that places that were counting on liquefied natural gas, like Pakistan, like Bangladesh, ended up with catastrophic blackouts because that natural gas wasn't available. And so you saw that as a result, Pakistan said, we're going to quadruple our coal fleet because we can't count on natural gas from the U.S. being there. Then, we have the U.S. administration saying, well, we're going to pause liquefied natural gas exports. According to the New York Times, they said we did this because we were consulting with a 25-year-old TikTok influencer. That was in the news. That's what they reported. So that is when those kind of decisions are made, are there some sort of compromises that have to be made to preserve building those global supply chains that will support a secure transition to cleaner energy sources?
Yes.
When what? What would you do?
There's a larger issue about there's triage there's a degree of triage that is required no matter what. Mike Gerard has a piece in the Environmental Forum last year. It's the same issue that Mario Liola's piece on permitting is in, about how, look, you're going to have to put wind places where you might not want it. You're going to have to put solar places where you might not want it. You're going to have to allow transmission lines to cross places that you wish you were kept pristine. On the issues you raise, we probably need to think about how to update our mining laws so that some of that mining occurs here. I'm not worried so much on the technology side. Andy Morris, who some people here know, has a paper coming out showing that if you look at the quality of patents, not merely at the quantity, the United States actually still is in the lead. That is to say, there's a way of identifying what patents in the clean energy space are actually the ones that are most important and represent the most significant innovation that additional developments rely upon. The United States is still well ahead in that regard. China just has the volume of patents, but they're relatively low-value patents. But for the physical stuff, right, we either are going to have to develop those supply chains, hope that there aren't political or strategic threats there, or do it domestically. And that's, yeah, we have to make those trade-offs. Just as the world is made safer by risky products, the world's going to be made cleaner by dirty things, right? We're going to have to be willing to dig some holes in the ground or do some other things to have the resources needed to make some of the other environmental progress we want to make.
There are some pieces of this clean energy transition that are hugely beneficial for the United States. You know, there's the international market for cars, for example. That's just international, and we could lose our standing. We probably already are if we don't keep going on EVs. That's an opportunity. That's an economic opportunity that I think should drive most of this analysis, not the TikToker.
I would very much agree and would like to strengthen your argument on the need of building international alliances. Yesterday, we had some discussion about the future of globalization, and it's clear that we have to reduce our dependencies from strategic adversaries like China. And we had to learn the hard lesson with Russia in Germany. But this should not and must not mean to reduce down to kind of national economics. Yeah, we have to rebuild economic alliances within the democratic world and with those countries who may be not democratic or not perfectly democratic, but at least who are not our adversaries, who are friendly or who are interested, like the Gulf states, yeah, and then other ones. And for Germany, it's totally clear. We have been importing round about 80% of our energy consumption from all over the world, especially oil and gas. And this portion will only will not be reduced really substantially. Maybe we will going down in a green energy economy to 60% imports. But we will need them, especially hydrogen. Hydrogen is absolutely key. So we should try not only between Europe and the US, for us, for instance, to build a kind of clean energy partnership with the Maghreb countries, with the North African countries, with their huge potential for solar energy, wind energy, and to allow them or to empower them to develop their own economy on the base of post-fossil energies, and at the same time to create supply chains for Europe. So we have to link these kind of environmental or ecological considerations with geopolitics. Climate transition is a geopolitical affair.
All right. Well, I think we have a lot of questions and only 6 minutes. So maybe how about we start with Gareth and Jan? Would you actually both quickly ask your question, and then we'll see if we're able to get over to this side of the room as well.
Okay, thank you. Is this working? Yeah, I'll do it at speed. I think it's important to recognise that both the EU and the US are actually doing pretty well, and their emissions are coming down very fast, and their energy transition is happening very fast. And as several speakers said, the challenge is really how to export that to the rest of the world. And on that, a very quick comment and a question. One is with there's a great deal of uncertainty about which technology or which technology mix is the future. This is hindering wind to some extent. The Netherlands gets as much from solar as from wind. You'd think this is a country which is next to the shallowest, windiest sea in the world and is not known for its sunny climate. You'd think wind is a no-brainer, and it's not working out quite that way. And until you really know what is optimal, people are reluctant to invest, and it's slowing things down. If somewhere, whether it's going to be Europe, maybe it'll be China or the US, can reach a point where they can say, no, this is a really optimal mix, then you can export it more easily. Because nobody wants second-rate cast-off technologies. And if the wind at the moment, they're nervous about. But the question is, the other way of exporting is not just saying, we can tell you how to get optimal energy, is by trade. And the EU has its CBAM, its carbon border adjustment mechanism. Massively controversial, quite interesting, but it's potentially a way of really leveraging it by basically saying if you want to export, then you're going to have to pay for your embedded carbon. I wonder what you think about this as a mechanism for exporting clean energy policy.
So I think we should also have Jan ask his question, and then we were given a couple-minute reprieve, but so we'll kind of respond to two questions at once. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question that's prompted by Bethany's framing of the issue, but ultimately goes to everybody. What's the relationship between litigation and legislation in making progress here? Because looking at the European landscape, my feeling is that people were initially lobbying for political action, got frustrated, and then took to the courts. And now all across Europe, we have those big landmark rulings forcing parliaments to take action, et cetera, et cetera. Now, so litigation on that kind of model is a kind of replacement form of action, a second best type of action. There's another way of thinking about it, and James mentioned the idea of a feedback loop. So kind of European integration scholars have been saying, well, we always start with litigation, with court cases. That creates all sorts of political problems, winners and losers, which forces lawmakers to take action. Those laws then end up creating rules and rights that prompts more litigation, et cetera. So there is this kind of, virtuous cycle or circle, as some call it. And I wonder, how do you see this? What's the kind of next step? How is this institutional dynamic going to play out?
Okay, so would somebody like to start with the carbon border adjustments and the check?
Yeah, could try. Of course, this is a very tricky question. Because, as I said in my introductory statement, this implies the risk of trade wars, and counter actions from China and others. On the other hand, without a level playing field between the EU and the other major global economic players, the ETS, the CO2 pricing, cannot work because it creates such a significant differences of cost levels between our industries and our consumers and those in other areas who don't have this kind of pricing mechanism, that it would just fail. So we need to create this kind of level playing field between the major economic players in the world. And CBAM is a kind of, I would say, it could trigger other processes. There are ideas of creating a climate club within the G7 world first, or in the OECD countries, and then trying to include China into it. But for a lot of environmental policies, not only CO2 pricing, you need this kind of balancing mechanisms in international trade. Otherwise, we will hit a wall.
And if anybody would like to either talk about that or the sort of litigation back and forth?
I guess in my mind, I could answer both questions at once a little. On carbon border adjustments, it's obviously the rational decision. There should be adjustments both going in and going out. That's obviously the economically smart move. It's just politically and legally tricky depending on the jurisdiction. Which gets to my other point, when you've got politics and legal issues in the way, and we're working together, and the corporations, the corporate sector that's building this stuff, and the politicians are more willing to collaborate, you could see this get fixed. And I think that is like, I don't know, it's probably idealistic. Earlier this morning, I was told I had like the young person's perspective, which I took as like really a compliment. So, you know, we've got like litigation, like, I don't know, like banging at the door. And that has spurred legislative changes before. Like I mentioned tobacco. I mean, Congress had failed, private lawsuits had failed over and over and over again, and finally we had litigation on behalf of states filling that gap and causing a bunch of changes that were national. And so you can see a feedback loop there that is positive, and that then includes corporations. Like I see them like lobbying for regulations of Instagram right now because I think they're worried about lawsuits. Like I saw it on like a bus stop in downtown DC the other day. So there's definitely an impact there on Congress that corporations could have if they feel the pressure.
There's a long history in environmental law of legislation and administrative regulation being seen as a replacement for litigation, in part because it can generate more certainty and predictability. It's also easier to protect incumbents against competition. I mean, there's a kind of Baptist bootlegger dynamic that often historically has unfolded, and may be a net beneficial one, right? So to say it's Baptist and bootlegger doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that there were folks that used it for their economic advantage. In the climate context, there have been some points in time in the last 10 years or so where it looked like some sort of grand bargain to reduce litigation risk and to reduce some regulatory risk in return for something like a carbon tax, which would be easier to deal with globally in terms of having border adjustments when your domestic regime is a tax regime as opposed to a regulatory regime. And as a way of generating a lot of certainty and administratively something far easier to do than cap and trade, far easier to do than sector-by-sector regulation. We didn't get those deals. We can have a long discussion about why we didn't get those deals. But certainly if you come from this from the standpoint of wanting there to be some big bargain on climate, it's much harder to see how that deal comes because the sorts of litigation that's left at the moment doesn't seem to be as big enough of a threat to force that sort of bargain. And in some respects, I would argue that the environmental community, by being unwilling to deal, gave up its best bargaining position. And it's certainly plausible the Supreme Court takes the Hawaii case next term and handicaps tort litigation against fossil fuel companies going forward. And then where does your bargain come from? Right? Because what can you offer fossil fuel companies and other groups as a trade for something like a carbon tax or something? And so that's something to think about.
So even with our stay of execution, we have 2 minutes, but I want to get both questions, and so this is the lightning round. Okay.
Be really quick. Just a bit dismayed that the panel hasn't really taken sector-by-sector regulation very seriously, or you kind of dismiss it. Whereas, you know, as a unit of analysis, economics takes place within industries, and the steering of those industries is on a sector-by-sector basis. Standards create cost pressure. Why not take these seriously still?
Also,
do you want me to answer now? Or?
No, he wants
very quickly, I'm all for bringing down the costs, but I think what is missing, you have to look at costs in a much broader context. So costs is also, when you look at migration these days, you know, according to UNHCR and other figures, about 60% of migration is now driven by droughts, floods, and environmental issues. So that is also a cost factor. Yeah. So that means bringing costs down. You can not leave it just to the free market system, because then we go back to the catalytic converter that you needed state intervention to get this thing done. So that means you need more regulation and more guidelines, not conflicting ones, streamlined, but without regulation, you will not actually get any transformation if you just leave it to competition.
I thought I did
Who
take
did advocate for no regulation? Nobody of us.
I'll say I'd give up all climate regulations tomorrow for a decent-sized revenue-neutral carbon tax, and it would do more because it'd be operating on every margin rather than locking in for periods of time standards that once are met, the cost pressures for additional innovation disappear because of the transaction costs and time necessary to replace one standard with the next generation of it. And the other reason why I'm dismissive of sector-by-sector regulation administratively is you just look at what the Environmental Protection Agency's administrative capacity is. It can't do it if we think this is an urgent problem. If we don't think it's an urgent problem, okay, they'll eventually get around to it. But it took and I'm going to get these numbers slightly wrong because but to design the sulfur dioxide cap and trade program for a few hundred facilities took the EPA something like 8 years. And that was about as simple a cap and trade program as you could think of trying to design for a very narrow, defined set of facilities. And so, thinking about doing that sector by sector by sector by sector when you're concerned about spillovers and bleeding, whatever, British Columbia did a revenue-neutral carbon tax from start to finish in, 6 months? So if we're thinking about incentives for innovation and change, we want to think about what allows us to operate on multiple margins simultaneously, because if we care about innovation, we need that. We also need to think about, and environmental law is terrible at this, and environmental economics is worse at this. Think about what the actual administrative capacity is to actually create the rules and regulatory or other governance structures that the system is going to rely upon. And in both environmental economics and environmental law, it's like a magic wand. Well, we'll just pass a law and then we will have rules. No, we will pass a law and then we will wait years and years and years and years for the rules to be drafted, commented upon, promulgated, litigated over, and then by that point we'll realize the rules are outdated and we need something else. And if they're standards-based rules, they create temporary lock-in, because you fight over what the standard is going to be, and once that's the standard, everyone meets that standard. But what we want is constant pressure for continuing innovation. So it's just thinking institutionally about what sort of structures we want and what we actually know how to do, and we're not very good about that in environmental law.
Okay, I'm doing some deep breathing.
This is what I wanted. I was trying to get this whole time.
He's like, it's environmental law's fault, when really it's all about the politics. We would have regulated power plants 10 years ago, but then there was a big rollback effort, and now we're here. I did actually write 2 papers with Ricky Revez about how agencies can issue rules that have more staying power, and I do think that's important. I think they both need to act fast. These statutes are difficult to implement. Jonathan's right, obviously, but they also need to issue regulations in a way that makes them more long-lasting. And Ricky and I wrote about how to do that, and I think he's actually doing that right now in the administration. And that is, I thought you would have noticed that I had these regulations on the screen. I was actually trying to make a very strong pitch there about how that's meaningful. I do agree with you that it's a big deal. It is sector by sector, and it's not enough. Jonathan's right about that too. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, because it could help. And then it's not, it's not about EPA, it's about the rollbacks. So if we actually do think it's a crisis and we want it to happen, then let's support the administration in doing it.
All right. Oh, Ralph, do you want to say?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just, I think nobody of us had been an advocate of zero regulation and let the markets do. My intention is how to get to kind of green market economy, and what is the smart regulatory framework you need for that, in a combination of pricing, infrastructure, then in investments, and incentives. And it's a total, I would say, it's a really okay. Let me be careful. It's quite a misleading idea that you need ever more detailed regulation and put one then regulatory law and then above the other, and that would solve our problems. It's the other way around. We are already in a critical point of over-regulation, which is bringing down the necessary innovative dynamics and the necessary investments which are crucial for the ecological transition. So please, let's depart from this idea, oh, we have a problem there, let's invent a new regulation, and we end with a jungle of incoherent rules and regulations which will lead us nowhere.
Well, I hope we can continue the argument during the break. So this is great. All right. Thanks so much.